And I'll just say very quickly, just in case there's anyone here who doesn't know Book Talk, it was originally established by Cardiff University in 2011, but since 2015 it's been organised through the School of English Communication and Philosophy. And book talkers such as yourselves are invited to diverse interdisciplinary research topics through themes that are discussed in classic and contemporary literature. And recently we've been hosting contemporary authors, as we are tonight. And the idea is that someone from another discipline can engage with the book and discuss research themes, but in a way that's understandable and engaging, as we're going to find tonight, I am sure. So I'd like to introduce our two guest speakers tonight. Meredith Miller is from the School of English Communication and Philosophy at Cardiff here. She was raised on Long Island in New York and came to the UK in 1997, moving to Wales permanently in 2018. She's published numerous short stories, novels, scholarly articles, and 2 monographs. And Fall River, the novel we'll be talking about tonight, is Meredith's 3rd published novel. And Professor of Governance and Development in the School of Geography and Planning at Cardiff University, Kevin Morgan has written widely on devolution and the development of cities, regions, and localities. And one of the common themes running through his research is the role and significance of place, a theme that looms large in his work on place-based innovation policies and on the role of cities and regions in devolved systems of political governance. And when Meredith and I were talking about this event, your original idea, I think, was maybe to have someone from politics, but the more we thought geography it was going to be. And I mentioned it to Kevin here, who said, yes, I'd love to do this. So I think you'll find that it's going to be an interesting discussion because it's going to bring in ways of looking at place from different disciplines, as seen in the novel itself. The structure of the evening is going to be the discussion for 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open up so that you can ask questions of both speakers for about 15 minutes. We have also here tonight Paula Bennett from Blackwell's. Paul Martin. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Who brought the books along because, as you probably realise, most of you going onto the Book Talk blog, it hasn't actually been published yet, this book. I think we're 2 days away. Is that right?
Friday, I think.
Friday. So you can have your early copies if you're interested, and Meredith kindly has offered to sign if you can wait around that long. But we're hoping to wrap up roughly at 8:30 tonight. So thank you for being here and enjoy the show. Pass you over.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if I'll need this, so I'll try without it for the moment. Welcome everybody to Spark, and Meredith, I thought I'd begin by putting you out of your misery, as it were, and telling you right from the get-go that I really enjoyed reading this book.
Thank you.
Really genuinely, I thought it was really absorbing and really engaging, and a kind of genre that I never thought existed, which might be called Cornish noir, which I'd never encountered before. Seriously, it really had a noirish feel to this novel. A really colourful cast of characters, set in an environment where the landscape itself somehow seemed to be a character in the narrative. At times really forbidding, threatening on the one hand, and at times benign and beautiful. So it varied through the course of the narrative. So I really enjoyed it, and I think I've got to start by asking a question that authors probably find cliche-ridden, but audiences always like. What's it about, and why did you write it?
Right, well, it's about landscape, which is why we've got a geographer, and the relation between people inhabiting different landscapes, and particularly the way that plays out in terms of fraught relationships of power in Britain, I think. And it started in a moment, an actual moment. I was with a literary agent, very young London literary agent, on a train going across that bridge there, which Sally has very kindly put up there. And I was living, for 13 years I lived in the Plymouth Dockyards, and you've probably gone over that bridge, many of you, and on one side is this really industrial dockyard landscape with tower blocks and housing estates and nuclear submarines, and on the other side there's this sort of bucolic pastoral kind of landscape, and the river literally divides those two landscapes so sharply right there. And I lived on the dockyard side in a row of terraces which were built around the turn of the century for dockyard workers in a place called Keam. And I was with this literary agent. We were on the nice train because she was going to London, so that was the nice shiny train where the Wi-Fi works and the toilets are nice and there's food and things like that, not the local train. You'll know about that in South Wales. Yeah. So as we went over that bridge and it curved around and you could look down on Keam, on these rows of terraces where Keam is, I said, oh, that's where I live right down there. And this literary agent looked at me and she said, oh, don't you find it soul destroying? And I looked at her and I said, yes. And I thought, this is it. This is very shortly after the Brexit vote, by the way, I should have said. And I thought, this is it. This is what's wrong with us. You know, that easy, facile disdain for the whole rest of the country. That is what's made people so angry and so vulnerable, you know, to these kinds of campaigns. You know, and that this is our sickness, if you will. And I thought, I've got to write something about the relationship between London and everywhere else. And then I thought, I need a character who goes to London and comes home again. And that's where Khadija came from.
Okay. Well, we've spoken about landscape and characters. Why don't you read a couple of excerpts from the book to kick us off? Because remember, you know, the audience hasn't read it yet. And
only Kevin.
To give a flavour of the landscape and characters.
Great. I should say I asked Kevin to pick the scene that I would read. And this is great because it's absolutely the scene that a geographer would pick. So that's really fun. But I'm just going to read the first couple of paragraphs because that will sort of situate you in this landscape. And then I'll read this little scene which involves, the novel centers around three cousins, Khadija, Joe, and a cousin called Alice. So you'll see Alice walking into the river in this first scene. She walks into the river and disappears. And you'll hear that referred to in the scene between these other two cousins, Khadija and Joe. The one who goes away and comes home again, and the other who stays. Am I loud enough? Can you hear me, Ange?
Yeah.
You might not have noticed her. You'd be distracted, maybe, by the spectacular curve of river and steel resolving out of the dark. The black hills hulking against the sky either side. The bridges, old and new, thrust into the rock of the banks. From, say, high up and godlike on the bridge tower, observing the whole grand sweep of it all, one hunched-over girl with her hair tucked into her hoodie, slouching her way down from South Pill to the landing stage, wouldn't necessarily catch your eye. Less important than a sparrow, really. She has tucked in the hair on purpose, because no one ever misses that. Even in security footage, it looks ginger. Her trainers blur a glow into the air, but that blends into all the visual noise of the street lights, traffic lights, bridge lights, the red and green sparks on the channel buoys, the porch lights, the strings of bulbs on the floating dock. Saltash doesn't get dark. The surrounding hills disappear after sunset, and the rest of the Hamoaze looks like fallen sky. Even the bees get night and day confused here. Alice throws her upper body back and lets her feet fall down the hill the way people do, having grown up on these tall banks, best friends with gravity. The river is flat below her. Like glass, they say, like a mill pond. But the river, Alice knows, is full of screams and sharp edges, oil fires and boilers exploding, and the whistle of bodies falling at gathering speed, the hard slap of the surface. And then that's where you are, anyway. And then I will read this more fun scene that Kevin picked. The rain is collected in all the depressions on Upper 4th Street. The 70s mosaics and the cracks in the pavement and the benches left over from when benches were benches and not strips of aluminium designed to tip rough sleepers off onto the ground. The wet air smells of grease from the chippy, sweat and laundry soap from the air ambulance charity shop. You'd notice Khadijah in the Saturday morning crowd by the bus stop even without anyone pointing her out. She looks like a summer person, out of place in March. Her clothes are from London, and she holds herself as though she's trying to shrink away from her own bones, staring at the fogged windows of the kitchen cafe. She is trying to see how many people are in there and whether one of them is her cousin Joe. She can't see through the windows, and the only way to clear them is to open the door. The plastic tablecloths have changed, but not the brown sauce dispensers or the all-weather carpet. Jo is there, sitting right next to the window with her phone in front of her face, filming the event of Khadijah coming through the door. Jo lives with that camera between her and the world. Now she's got that pregnant belly for a buffer as well. Khadijah knocks some chairs aside coming through. She doesn't fit the furniture here anymore, as if she's blind and they've moved it. Everything is closer together than it should be. She opens her arms and makes Jo stand up to hug her. "Fucking hell, you look amazing," Jo says. They squeeze together with Jo's belly between, then pull back for second looks. "You too. The bump suits you. Like, really suits you." Tammy Williams says I'm going to be prettier as a mum, whatever that means. But you, Bird, looking all London and Indian shit. Shut up. In London, I felt Cornish as fuck. The whole first year up there, I felt like I was wearing a sign that said, "Ask and I'll show you my 6 toes." Then I realized it was all about my face and my name. Everyone just assumed I was from Chigwell or somewhere, as long as I kept my mouth shut. The don't give a shit look is fit, though. You're like one of those actresses that looks even better when they get caught without straighteners or makeup. Like you didn't bother to put anything together, but you don't even need to. Because Jo remains Jo. She says whatever occurs and it all just bounces off and floats away. No one minds. Everyone in the cafe is still looking at them. They're all saying to themselves, "Them sleep women are trouble. Spooky, a lot of them." Then there's Jo's baby that Ben didn't give her, and everyone in town knows that too. But it doesn't matter now. I forgot how much better everything feels with you around. Khadijah pulls out a chair and throws her coat onto the wide windowsill. How is that not Ben's baby? What the hell? We broke up for a while. I explained this already. Slag. Khadijah laughs. You're supposed to be little. I'm supposed to say something all wise and helpful right now. This is too weird. You look different, Jo says. The same, but different. People would say a bit middle class, but that ain't it. Just, you've been somewhere else, and it shows. Your accent keeps going in and out. I'm from here, Jo. I'm so absurdly from here, it's not even funny. That's depressing. Listen, Bert, Alice didn't come home last night. She never turned up at school yesterday, but nobody noticed till lunchtime. I heard. You know she'll be at a friend's. Aunt Debbie will be losing it until she comes home, little shit. I don't know, Cuddy. She's got worse lately. Well, how's your mum? She's fine. The same. Tell me about London. It looked awesome in your posts. They look out over 4th Street at all the people who never cross the bridge and never bother with umbrellas because the rain is sideways and nothing will ever dry out. It wasn't awesome, Joe. I know you think everywhere else is better, but it isn't. In London, you spend half your life on the tube and the buses. There's loads of cool stuff to do, but you can't do it because once you pay the rent, you're utterly skint and it takes an hour to get anywhere from your flat. All you can do is stay home, make toast, and use someone else's Netflix password. Literally, the only nice thing about London was that nothing happened to me there. It was dead restful. But then it got, I don't know, kind of suffocating. I think I'll stop there.
Okay, that's a good introduction to both the landscape and some of these really colourful characters, these very, very strong women characters that we'll come back to in a few moments. But the reason I suggested that Meredith read that section was because it brings together that old story. You know, we're all from somewhere. Many of us travel away from that place, and we have this complicated relationship to where we're from and where we live now. Many of us negotiate that transition. You know, and as a geographer, of course, one of the hardy perennials of geographical thought over the last 30 years longer is the relationship of core and periphery. Cores defined in economic, political, cultural terms, and peripheries, what we now call the left behind places, as it were. But of course, the core in the UK is unique in many ways. It's the opposite of Germany. Economic, political, cultural power is all distributed in different places in Germany. Whereas in London, in the UK, all roads lead to London, in a sense. And I'd read the novel like this, as a core periphery story, maybe because of my discipline, as it were. But I read it as Khadija, for me, the central character in the book. She goes to London to get educated. She acquires expertise and networks in London that she deploys when she goes back home to resolve problems that were unresolvable for her before she went to London. In other words, she acquires knowledge and networks which turn out to help her to solve riddles back home. That's how I read it. But does that make sense to you? Maybe you didn't write it like that.
Well, I mean, I kind of love that reading because it says something I might not have thought to say, but of course that is the story that's being told, isn't it? Although I have to say, I know when we talked about the novel, you liked Khadija, you found Khadija fascinating, she's your favourite character. I like her, obviously, but I have a real soft spot for Jo, actually, because Jo...
The woman who stayed behind.
She doesn't leave. She just owns it. She just stays there.
Yeah.
And she has this, this wit and this talent, and she has those fantasies. She's a prey to those mass culture and pop culture fantasies that, and thinks, she wants to go to London, but she never does. And she finds everything she needs where she is. And it's partly just her attitude. And I think I was saying to you, I met a quite wonderful woman from the Valleys at an event on International Women's Day who's just founded her own record label. And she got into this sort of exploitative relationship with a record label, as so often happens to young women, and she had to give up all the rights to her first album to get out of this. And then she just stayed right where she is in the Valleys, and she made this record label called Soinuraig, and she just owned it. She just did it. She just said, okay, I'm giving all of that up and I'm keeping this. I'm giving up this other relationship to power, to centralize power, if you will, and I'm just going to do this right here, right where I am, which is kind of what Jo does, isn't it? So there are those two stories, which are maybe two ways of thinking about, or maybe are they both liberating in different ways, maybe?
Sure, but they're both examples of what I said earlier about, you know, the novel is populated with strong women characters. In fact, I was hard pressed to find a man. And when in a sense, not being entirely facetious, but when men do appear, they're either mad, bad, or dead. But they're entirely marginalised figures in the story. You know, what's that about? I mean, was that by design or default?
Yeah. I mean, I have to, you know, before I give you the clever answer, I will own up and just say that's my tendency anyway. I mean, I just find women characters interesting. And I've set out twice to write novels where I've gone, okay, I'm going to write about men and I'm going to write about masculinity. And it's always some kind of dissident masculinity anyway. So, but Khadijah asks your question in the very last scene of the novel. And I don't want to make... do any spoilers, but it's not Khadijah, sorry. Anthony asks Khadijah the question, what happened to all the men? And Khadijah says, they're dead. They're all dead. So one of the big drivers for the novel for me, when I looked at this landscape, when I had this moment, and I was like, I'm going to write this novel, I thought, okay, I live here. What are the features of this community? And one was asbestos poisoning, and the number of men in dockyards everywhere in Britain and around the world, but certainly in the Plymouth dockyards. And the statistics are actually in the back of the novel, in the acknowledgements. So all these men are dying of asbestos poisoning. And men are dying of industrial accidents. There's a huge military presence. Men are signing up to the military. They're either not coming home or they're coming home hurt in one way or another, physically or psychologically. The cancer rate in the Barn-Barton estate, which is right next to North Yard, is 10 times what the cancer rate is 3 miles away in Manamede. You know, the posh bit with the double-fronted villas. So, and then there's the drugs that come in on the Navy boats, and everyone knows the hard drugs come in on the Navy boats, but no one seems to do anything about that, so lots of men die. And then there's just the kind of community violence that happens. So the death rate is sharply gendered. And so then what have you got? You've got all these grieving women. And these sort of survivors and these grieving women. And so then there's the other feature of the community that I wrote about in the novel, which is spiritualist churches and psychics and card readers and palm readers, which is such a huge part of British culture that is almost never represented. And we talked about Beyond Black, didn't we? Hilary Mantel's Beyond Black, which is the one novel I can think of that's about this pervasive culture. I mean, it's everywhere in the valley, spiritualist churches, aren't they? They're everywhere. So there are lots of women who talk to the dead in the novel as well. But yeah, where are all the men? All the men are dead, except for Anthony.
Well, we'll come back to Anthony in a moment, but even that kind of theme reminded me actually of the parallels, you know, between this landscape that Meredith is discussing and the valleys. You know, I remember, you know, hosting a friend from London when I was a student, and he came to the village in Cynnan Valley and talking to people in the pub. And we walked home, and he said, I was shocked by so much tales of death, that many men have died. And of course the parallel asbestosis in Cornwall, pneumoconiosis in the valleys. And so many parallels in our village. It was a village of strong women, widows, many of them widows, who had bonded together I grew up in that kind of environment. So many parallels. But Anthony, this is the one guy that is populated in the novel, and how can I put this? He is the embodiment of Thatcherism. He embodies every value of neoliberalism one could think of. And right from the get-go, I felt here was a baddie. You know, he was being set up as a baddie. Did you consciously?
Yes, I mean,
Oh,
he
right,
is,
okay.
and I worried that he's too much of a two-dimensional
Okay.
baddie, and so I tried to create some sympathy for him. Yeah.
Well, of course, that failed, I think. Because only in this. When I had my gut instinct confirmed, by the way, about Anthony, and you may, when you read it, you may find this yourselves. It was when the reader discovers that even Anthony's mother hates him. You think there's no redemption for this character, surely, when even his mother doesn't like him, you know?
I wanted you to pity him because his mother doesn't like him.
It had the opposite effect, actually, and the readers will make their own mind up about Anthony. But Anthony does well. Economically, he does well for himself in a very individualistic way. You know, he's one of those guys that follows the narrow path of self-advancement. That ambition is all highly personal, and he's done well for himself economically.
I would say, yeah, he's taken the one way out. You know, you're not going to join the army, you're not going to work in the dockyard, you're not, you know, you can join this frothy economy of grift that comes from the privatization of all of our public services, right? That's your way out if you're Anthony, if you're in his position, if you come from his community. You can put on a shiny suit and you can become the head of an academy. I mean, we're lucky in Wales, we don't have academies, but you know, all those other equivalents, you can do NHS procurement or whatever it is, you know. So that's his way out. That's how he gets a new build, you know, and a nice car and all of those things.
I must say, I got a confession to make here. I got very, very nerdishly excited when I came across a section on procurement, public procurement. You know, this has been one of my research niches for 20 years. I'm coming out to you tonight by saying that, because I always say to my students, you know I can never, ever persuade you that procurement is a sexy subject, but I hope to persuade you it's an important subject. And the reason being, of course, we spend over 300 billion every year on public procurement. 1 in every £3 that the public sector spends is on procurement. And that's why it's the #1 source of corruption and fraud. And so it proves. I hope that's not
absolutely.
giving away too much.
Now your students can read this novel about procurement.
Okay.
What was great was that you picked up the little hints far earlier than anyone else would, because you study procurement.
Well, because I was a nerd, a procurement nerd. That's why, and it is part of the warp and weft of the book. It's tied in really, really nicely until all is revealed in chapter 43, the last chapter, which we won't talk about tonight. But because, you know, I want other people to have their chances to grill you as well, maybe we could bring the conversation to a close now, coming back to my favourite character, not yours, Khadija, because I feel she really does embody this, the tensions of a multiple identities, you know. She's not just a Cornish woman, she's been away, she's come back, she's a different woman. She comes back a different woman, and it's that combination of continuity and change that she embodies. And I wondered whether that was consciously designed.
I wonder as well whether it has something to do with being a migrant myself as well, because somebody asked, I think we were speaking Welsh, but somebody said to me, where do you still refer to the States as home? And I said, well, I'm a migrant, so home is always where I'm not. So when I'm in the UK, I call the US home, and when I'm in the US, I call the UK home. And, you know, once you've moved and you've come back, home becomes this otherwhere concept, doesn't it? And I think she has a bit of that. She doesn't sit anywhere anymore. And she also always feels like she has to compensate for everyone around her. She's holding everyone up, you know.
Well, her very name is an odd name, you know. I personally didn't know the history of the name Khadija, and you said sleep was a popular Cornish name.
Yeah.
Or,
Sleep, as is bone. There's a
oh, yeah,
brief
the
mention
bones,
of Thomas Bone. Yeah.
but Khadija.
So Cornish
Is
people have
Mar-
great last names. Yeah. Sleep and bone and yeah. So she came. Her name came first, I think. But yeah, Khadija's the wife of the Prophet, of course. Some of you probably know that. And her father has named her that. Yeah.
Who's Moroccan.
He's Moroccan. Yeah.
Okay, but he doesn't appear in the book.
Except by letter. Yeah.
Better. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, let's bring things to a close there, and open up for other people to ask questions or to make comments.
Great.
I know there are some Cornish elements in the audience this evening who may want to grill us on
Please
local
do,
culture.
yes.
So anyway, it's open to our audience. Oh, a Cornishman. Thank you for coming to my rescue.
Kev primed me
Yeah.
to ask. So, well, thank heavens you didn't make you read the bit about procurement. I don't know whether you've read this book, and it doesn't matter if you haven't, but there was what I thought was a really good book a couple of years ago by a woman called Lamorna Ash called Dark Salt Clear. I found it a very interesting book. She actually wrote it as a master's thesis as a UCL anthropology student, I think. But she spent a year living in Mausen,
Oh, right.
down in the west, and your interaction between the people who had stayed and the people who had been away reminded me of a scene, if I recall it correctly. She lived with a family in Mousel, in the community, and if I recall correctly, she also had a job in a fish shop, and then she went back, maybe she went back for her studies, or she went back to London for a while, and as I recall it, she sort of tells the story of sort of bouncing back into the to the fish shop where she'd worked and saying hi to the people she'd worked with, and they all almost looked at her like they didn't know who she was. And she wasn't from there originally, although she had Cornish connections. So I wondered about this. There's the people who've stayed, there's the people who've gone away and come back, but then there are the people who come
and go.
and come and go and maybe want to be more part of something than the Cornish allow. I wonder whether that resonates in terms of the. I mean, we haven't read the book, so I don't know how that sounds in the context of the book. Although it might be quite interesting to read Dark Salt Clear as a
And it's a
different
participant
insight.
observation thing. So
Sorry?
it's a participant observation thing.
Yeah,
It's a
yes,
non-fiction.
yeah.
Oh, that's
She
brilliant,
actually
yeah.
does.
Yeah.
She's particularly interested in the fish. It's not Mousel, it's Newlyn, I think she actually lives, and
Right,
Newlyn
yeah.
is the biggest of the
Yeah.
fishing ports in Cornwall. So she's actually interested in the fishing community and the fishers. She actually persuades them to let her go on a trawl at one point.
You're making me think of Wales, really, when you say that. I mean, I live in the Dyfi Valley, so when you talk about those people who come and go, of course I think about that, not just the second homers, but people like me. I live there, but I'm in Cardiff 2 and 3 nights a week, and we're all encouraged to make these kind of lives, and then I always feel like there's some sort of terrible wrenching going on in terms of how attached people are to place and how people's identities are so rooted in place. Anybody here who lives in Wales, that Welsh conversation. I mean, it happens more in Welsh than in English, but it's like, where are you from? Where exactly? Wait, exactly where? Oh, my brother-in-law lives over the hill there, and and he married my sister's cousin, and they moved over here. And so you always have to have that. It takes 5 or 10 minutes, I find. Where exactly are we all related to each other in this landscape that we inhabit? And it's almost like a ritual. And I just think it's a beautiful thing to watch. I always feel really privileged watching it go on. But then I think that is the source of that terrible kind of wrenching that's going on, all over Wales, or maybe not in Cardiff, but everywhere else in Wales, And then I think, is that just modernity? Is that just inevitable? Is that just happening? Or is there something we can do to think our way around that, or begin to think differently? Because I love that Welsh question, how are we all connected to each other in this landscape that we inhabit? It's a beautiful question. It's a beautiful sentiment, you know. I don't know if I answered your question at all. Yeah, sorry.
Well, I mean, there is a geographical sensibility about this, isn't there? In the sense that I remember, sometimes we only recognise ourselves when we see ourselves through the eyes of others, as it were. I remember an Italian friend saying to me, I thought Italy was the main place, the most localist culture in Europe, let's say, until I came to Wales. And I realised that there was something called not just localism, but there was, is it hyper-localism? It's almost as if we can't really begin to understand or appreciate a person until we've seen him or her through the prism of place. You know, and as you say, we need to have that, you know, like the famous joke about this, isn't it? When two Welshmen meet in a bar in New York, and one says, "Where are you from?" And he says, "Come talk." And the guy says, "Don't talk in generalities, man. Upper or lower." and you know, I know it's an old joke, but I think I still like it, and it captures that hyper localism. There's something about the world, and of course, we sometimes tell stories about that as if there is an entirely benign thing, whereas oftentimes this is a Janus-faced thing, isn't it?
Yes.
It has great qualities of warmth and attached sense of belonging, but oftentimes it can turn into a more noxious sensibility in terms of maybe not being entirely welcome to migrants. And at a time of nativist politics, political leaders can prey on those things. You know, I always remember, because I do a lot of work on food, remember when the fascist mayor took over Rome, Rome had the finest school meal service in Europe. The very first thing that he did was to abolish the ethnic menus, you know, and he introduced all the traditional menus so that they didn't smack of anything from Africa or Asia or anything like this. So we have to be aware of those things. The Golden Dawn in Greece created pantries for the poor, only for Greeks, not for non-Greeks. So localism, you know, cuts both ways, it seems to me. So we shouldn't just think it's a warm, fluffy, benign feeling. Claire.
Yeah, I suppose just sort of following on from that, there's a kind of cross-cutting in relation to class here, I think, because you know, if you're middle class, certainly if you're upper middle class, you are brought up to feel extremely mobile. You may very well be brought up in a place that your parents did not grow up in. That's my experience. Suburban London, mother born in India, father born in Guernsey, and when I left the place I grew up, I never returned. Because nobody did, you know, people went away and they worked in other places. And so I've always been mesmerised and fascinated by the sense of belonging that I've seen in Wales, particularly, but also in the mining village I worked in Yorkshire. And I do think that it's, you know, that you know, the danger of being fluffy is that you ignore the fact that localism is nurtured by people who often have no choice, who have to stay, and so they create something out of that. You know, that's what the valleys are about too. They create something out of that, and something is lost by mobility, but it's also a reflection of privilege as well.
Yeah. Yes, I absolutely agree. And I think also one of the things that you see in the book is and that you also see in a lot of Valleys literature, it's also a prison. You know, it feels imprisoning. It's entrapped. You know, you feel very entrapped in that. You're always being seen. You know, you're always grounded, you're always being seen, there's that piece of it as well, isn't there? But I think that's really true. I was at an event the other week, and a couple of people spoke up about the Welsh language, and then somebody else spoke up and said, yes, but I don't, all that patriotism and nationalism, that's not for me. And there was just this immediate association of the language with those kind of politics. And I thought, wow, this is frightening, this is worrying, you know. We need to do something about this. We need to make some anthologies that are just all the minority languages in Wales, all together, everything but English, you know, or something, you know, to try and just kind of take apart this notion of a national language that's privileged over others or something, do you know what I mean? And I say that as a real lover of the language, you know, but I just thought that's really worrying if this kind of local grounding becomes in any way nationalistic.
Yeah, well, this is a novel about left behind places. One could read it like that, and what happens to people, how do they make out in those environments. But Claire, going back to your point, you remember thinking of the famous Theresa May speech, you know, where she talked about citizens from somewhere versus citizens from nowhere. That's going to be one of the big tropes of the future of politics, you know, and so it is with populism. You know, populism in the States, you know, the metropolitan centres versus rural and old post-industrial places. Those are big cleavages. We see it now in Europe with the green backlash against the Green Deal and things like this. Politicians playing on these deep feelings about people who are left behind versus those who have done well under globalization. So I read the book in terms of those tropes. Please.
I spent a year as a student planner trainee in 1972 in Plymouth, so I can sort of feel I can very much visualise this book already just from the little that Meredith has read out. But I'm just interested in you talking so much about Cornwall, because my understanding is that the Tamar is the boundary between Devon and Cornwall, and the beautiful, you know, little seaside, little tiny fishing villages and all the countryside is in Cornwall, and Plymouth is the city. But is it Cornwall?
Yeah, I mean, Saltash is technically in Cornwall, yeah, but you're absolutely right. And I think the river is this huge divide between this much more pastoral kind of landscape and this very industrial dockyard landscape of Plymouth. I remember I got in a taxi once in Truro and the trains had failed again, and the taxi driver was going to take me all the way home to Plymouth, because they used to do that back then when your train failed, and he rang his mate on the radio. I mean, it's about, I don't know, it's like 40 miles, or no, it's probably maybe a little bit more than 40 miles, but not much. And he rang his mate on the radio and said, guess what, I'm going over the bridge. It's like, you know, and it's like it's another world over the bridge. You know, this guy was maybe in his 60s. Yeah, you know, yeah, going to England, exactly. Yeah, guess what? I'm going over the bridge. You know, so it feels like this enormous divide in every possible way, social, cultural, etc. But to go back to your point and Claire's, I think that it's that anger that's so dangerous, and the just easy disdain for everything that's happening in these communities, that, you know, it was there, I think, because I don't want to get too into it, but I was really upset by the calls for a second referendum. I campaigned for Remain, I was a Remainer, but when people called for a second referendum, I just thought, this is so dismissive, and it's so, you don't understand what just happened if you're asking for a do-over. You don't get it, you know. You don't get why, you know, where this anger is coming from and why these dangerous people can harness it, you know. And so I wanted to write a novel where anybody from any region like this or community like this would be able to look at it and go, yeah, that's a lot like where I grew up. And yeah, I feel seen, you know, and I feel like somebody understands where all this anger is coming from, you know. And it was great when Rachel and I did the interview, because Rachel said, oh yeah, I'm from the valleys, and this just, you know, so much of this rung so true for me. And I thought, yes, like this is what I was hoping for. You know, that somebody in Yorkshire somewhere would read the novel and go, oh yeah, I get this. And that we could maybe begin to see each other a little bit more. You know, specifically because of those dangers of localism. And, you know, when you ignore something, it just festers, isn't it? You know.
Rachel, was there a question that you wanted to ask? You
Yeah,
had your hand up.
what struck me about the novel when I read it was that it wasn't really set in a regional place. You've got colloquialisms like bird, and I loved that. But I wanted to ask you about the publishing industry, because I think the disparity between London and the regions is also reflected in the literature that's published today and in the publishing industry generally. And I was wondering if you had any comments about that.
Yeah, and I think that's not just national, it's global. So, you know, my first 2 books were bought in New York, not just in London, but in New York. But they went through a London agent, and then they were sold in New York. And that was a really awful experience for me. It was very alienating. I was totally alienated from the means of their production, you know, just completely, in every way. And so now, working with Hono is like, you know, working with this very small, very local press. It's just a very different feeling. And sometimes when you work with Hono, your books don't get outside of Wales. Sometimes they do, you know, but sometimes they don't. And that's fine. I'm happy with that. That's fine, you know, because I just feel so much more connected to what I'm doing. So I would say that's one of the things we're really lucky in being in Wales. There's this very, very lively small press landscape. And this very, very lively culture of appreciating those small presses and appreciating literature. And, you know, like I belong to the local literary circle in Brodovy. And I mean, you know, where else do people have that? Like every community has the local literary circle, you know. And you talk about the literature, of course, from your place. But it's brilliant, and I love it. And it, you know, the idea that that's just some sort of like a common, you know, commonality that we all have. And I think that has a lot to do with the language, with being a bilingual country. People who fight for the Welsh language understand that literature and a healthy publishing landscape are absolutely crucial to the health of a language. And English language presses, in spite of what we may have all read in certain periodicals recently, I think English language presses really benefit from that. So, but you know, publishing in both languages. So I'd say, yes, it's awful and it's alienating, and 5 publishing houses own over 50% of the publishing on Earth, and that's not healthy, but that you're really, really lucky to be in Wales, because there's such a lively small press landscape, and it's a much nicer way to work for an author, I think. Yeah.
No, I just want to, we want to leave time this evening for an opportunity to buy some books and maybe have a signed book, a signed copy of Meredith's one.
I've got to go get a pen.
I've got a pen. But first of all, I'd like to thank so many people tonight just for making this event possible. It's been marvellous. It's been really thought-provoking, some really deep parts of the conversation, far-reaching. And to both our guests tonight, I think they deserve some warm applause.